Yes, so Peter Ahabwe Babigumira is a pharmacist with health diplomacy, health system strengthening, and public health technical expertise. His research focuses on biosecurity, antimicrobial resistance, and emergency preparedness. He works with the Infectious Disease Institute at the College of Health Sciences, Makerere University. He serves with the Secretariat for Uganda's co-chair with the Africa CDC of the Global Health Security Agenda Action Package on Biosafety and Biosecurity for 2021-2022. He served in a similar capacity in 2019-2020 period as Uganda chaired the Action Package on Antimicrobial Resistance. He is attached to the Uganda Ministry of Health Public Health Emergency Operations Center as the technical advisor for emergency preparedness and response. He coordinates the surge team at COVID-19 Situation Room, a specialized PHEOC for COVID-19. It supports international health regulation implementation and monitoring and evaluation. He actively participated in the organization and conducting of joint external evaluation, after action review and simulation exercises. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Mr. Peter Ahabwe Babigumira.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Ian. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I bring you warm greetings from Lusaka, Zambia. And today we are going to be looking at Africa's experience with global catastrophic biological risks. Next slide. So we are going to look at the definitions, then we are going to look at 3 scenarios in which we can have them. Then we are going to look at near GCBRs, because as the previous speaker highlighted, we do not have any real extinction events that we have observed. Ideally, if we had observed them, most of us would have died off, and the odds of us being the survivors and passing on that information are low. So we can't say they have never been there, but at least from what we call the antiquity, that's the BC, till now, there have not been any observed. But we shall look at the near ones. Then we shall look at cholera and the third plague in the 19th century, pandemic influenza, and then we'll wrap up with the recent history. That's the 21st century and up to the present. And then we shall also look at the summary timeline and lessons learned. Next slide. So, biosecurity encompasses the measures and procedures to protect the population from harmful biological substances and infectious diseases. So that's for this setting. Although ideally, we usually say that biosafety is protecting the people from the bugs, and biosecurity is protecting the bugs from the people. But in this context, we're just generalizing to look at, because of the global outlook, the security of our species in general. So just to make that clear for this particular presentation. So again, our previous speaker highlighted so much about GCBRs, but basically it's good to note that they are caused by biological agents, and they can negatively and permanently alter the long-term trajectory of humanity or result in human extinction. Next slide. As noted, this is the long and elaborate Hopkins definition, which looks at naturally emerging or re-emerging, deliberately created and released, or lab engineered and escaped, that could lead to sudden, extraordinary, widespread disaster beyond the collective capability of the nation and international governments and the private sector to control. And if unchecked, they would lead to great suffering and loss of life and sustained damage to national governments, international relationships, economies, societal stability, and global security. So the best example is COVID-19. Imagine COVID-19 was much more horrible. Let me say, imagine COVID-19 killed off 90% of its victims. Just imagine in its current form, it has damaged so many international relationships. How much worse could it get? So we have three scenarios. We have natural pandemics. These are like what we talked about before, like the COVID-19 emerged naturally, or it is disputed, but let's say for this presentation it emerged naturally. Then we have accidental release, another scenario in which someone has engineered a pathogen, but it has accidentally been released, which is the other half of the COVID-19 scenario. Half of the people believe it occurred naturally, half of the people believe it was engineered in a lab and accidentally released. And then the third scenario is if it was a deliberate attack. If someone deliberately engineers a pathogen to harm lives. Next slide. So some of us may ask, what is the difference between an incident, an event, a disaster, a crisis, and a global catastrophic risk and an existential risk? So the difference is the number of lives affected. If your incident affects the numbers in the single digits, so like 5 people died in an attack or 6 or 7, that's an incident. If it affects in the tens to thousands, then that is an event. So like 500 people, 600. Then a disaster, we are looking at thousands to hundreds of thousands. Then a crisis is hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions. The best example would be the Pakistani flooding crisis, whereby you have large numbers of people affected. And then finally, you have a global catastrophic risk. This is one that single-handedly clears off hundreds of millions plus. Even the World War II had fatalities in the upwards of 55 million. The 1917 influenza had similar figures. So that means at most they were crises. They did not break the barrier to be global catastrophic risks. And then an existential risk, we are looking at something which can wipe out the greater part of 7 billion human beings. Next slide. So this is a formula that was really well thought out by Piers Millet, and he was trying to appreciate how much will we save if we invest in preparedness and risk mitigation over a large amount of lives affected. And it just found that it's more cost effective to invest now when you have the lesser numbers. Next slide. Okay, so the near GCBRs, the most notable ones, we are going to go through a lot, but these are the most notable ones. The plague of Justinian in the 571 to 542. CE is what they prefer to call AD these days. So CE is, take it as AD. And the total deaths was 6 to 25 million. And at that time, they accounted for 3 to 13% of the world's population. Then he moved forward to the thousands, 1300s. The Black Death killed 20 to 70 million. And this was 9.7% of the world's population at the time. And then we have the Spanish influenza, 1918-1919, which killed 50 to 100 million, which was 3% of the world's population. Next slide. So why is Africa so vulnerable to GCBRs? We have the meningitis belt, we have the yellow fever belt, we have a lot of civil wars, hence a lot of internally displaced peoples, a lot of refugees. We have a lot of the issues of these rebel groups, terrorism. We have globalization issues, trade, porous borders. especially even the water ports are porous these days. We have climate change issues, floods, landslides, and then we also have dual-use risk havens in Africa, whereby some shady researchers could opt to come to Africa to do their research due to weak regulatory and administrative barriers. Next slide. So now we are in what historians call the antiquity, which is from BC to AD. We have 4 notable things. So before some of you start dozing off thinking it's a history lesson, I am not going to go through the larger history of these outbreaks. I'm going to focus on what we know about Africa during those times, because I want us to glean some lessons from our past. So we had the plague of Athens, the Antonine plague, the plague of Justinian, and the Black Death at those times. Next slide. So what we know about all these things, the method is historical epidemiology, which kind of merges methods of archaeology, history, and epidemiology. And by studying ancient societies like the Great Zimbabwe, we kind of can reveal how communities dealt with outbreaks and pandemics. Next slide. So this is just a very important thing for you to note. This is what Africa looked like pre-colonial. That is before the 1900s, more precisely 1915. Now I want you to note very closely how Africa responds to pandemics, and how the African landmass, its kingdoms and tribes are distributed between now and after colonialism. Next slide. So we do know that for those of you who read the Bible or the Quran, it's the earliest book that kind of tries to talk about pandemics and outbreaks, and it talks about the 10 plagues that struck the Egyptians, and of course Egypt was in Africa. And historians have gone back to look at these plagues, and they have likened them to be some to have been of infectious nature, like lice, diseased livestock, boils, and the death of the firstborn, a variety of infectious diseases, zoonosis, and parasitosis. So this is the earliest example we have of plagues or outbreaks in Africa. Next slide. So the plague of Athens, what do we know? Surprisingly, it is believed it originated in Ethiopia and spread through Egypt and Greece. The plague of Athens affected the majority of inhabitants of the overcrowded city-state of Athens. So please note, when I showed you the map of Africa, many of the kingdoms were interspersed around the map, but in Athens, we had a very overcrowded city-state. So the containment strategies used at the time was application of purifications, incantations, and enforcement of abstinence from birth. So people at that time had very underdeveloped public health practice. Next slide. So move forward to the Antonine plague. This one happened from 1961 to 161 to 180 AD. And this one, they believe it was brought into Rome from people coming from Seleucia, and it affected many places, including Egypt. Now, unlike the plague of Athens, which was geographically limited, this one spread across a vast territory of the entire Roman Empire. And this is because the empire was economically and politically integrated. So looking back at how African kingdoms were not exactly politically integrated, so they had that interspersed nature. Next slide. So then the plague of Justinian, this one was known as the all-consuming and distracting plague. It is followed trade routes of sailors and the like, and the outbreak, it plagued Asia, Africa, and Europe, leaving a huge death toll. Next slide. And then we have, now this is where the African evidence starts. We have a place called Ketu, Mapumbugwe, and between 1000 AD and 1200 AD, it is hypothesized that there was a community which existed at this site called Ketu that thrived on agriculture, cattle, metallurgy. Now, what is interesting is it was discovered that there was a high number of barriers, 94, 76 of which belong to infants aged 0 to 4. And this translated into a mortality of 5%. Now, note that this is the same mortality of South Africa during the 1917 influenza. So this was a high mortality rate. So this community rapidly abandoned Ketu. So there's evidence that Ketu was randomly abandoned around the time of these deaths, around the time of these barriers. So here we can start to see that ancient Africans usually prefer to abandon settlements and resettle when an outbreak or a pandemic happened. Next slide. Then we also have the Black Death. This one lasted some 500 years, and it's believed that it began from galleys from Genoa sailing from the Black Sea and docking in Sicily. Next slide. Now, evidence of of the Black Death in Africa can be found in Ghana. There's a place such as Akrokrawa, that is from 950 AD to 1300 AD. And here again, we find evidence of a rapidly abandoned settlement around the same time as the Black Death. So here we can see again that evidence that these African communities preferred to move whenever there were outbreaks and pandemics. They would resettle their villages. Next slide. So far we've covered the Antoine Justine Black Death. So now we are moving into the 1500s. Next slide. So the cholera is one of the biggest things that was happening for Africa at least. And we had 7 major cholera outbreaks. The first 3 happened from 1817 to 1856. In the middle of cholera, there was a third plague outbreak. We had talked about the previous slides, like Antoinine and whatever. Then we had 3 more cholera outbreaks, which we noted up to the 7th one, which is really the current phase we are in. Next slide. So for cholera, I won't go into the details, but I want you to note is, if you look at this map, it shows the spread of the pandemic. And if you see, it follows a lot the coastal towns or the areas which are near water, not entering into the core. So I want us to know that in our GCBRI strategies, port health and border health will be a very, very key factor. Next slide. So then we look at the third plague. This one devastated many parts of the world, including places like Cape Town and Senegal. It is believed that Senegal was so hit by this third plague in 1914 that the country was set back by 30 whole years. Next slide. Then we look at the transition I told you about. This is Africa in 1980. You look at all the kingdoms and all the distributed places. Now look at Africa after scramble and partition. We have this large move to consolidate the many African regions into blocks. Next slide. So we go and now look at influenza. We first noted with the Russian flu of 1989. Then we have the Spanish, Asian, and Hong Kong flus. Then we have SARS, swine flu, and MERS, which is in our current decade or our current century. And then finally, we have our most recent example of COVID-19. Next slide. So the Russian flu is responsible for over 1 million deaths and lasted and had resurgence for every year for 3 years. Next slide. And so this is just a map showing you the spread of these influenzas over the years and the different variables. Some of you hear things of H1, H2, H3, H1, H7. So this one just kind of summarizes that. Next slide. So then we look at the mother of all pandemics, the H1N1, the 1918 virus, and this one, next slide. This is a map that shows you how it spread. And again, I want you guys to notice a similar theme again. If you look at this map, you can notice all through the first, second, and third waves, the core was largely abandoned. And a lot of the spread happened around port cities as entry points. Like you can look around Eritrea, you can look around That looks like Tanzania, Mozambique. You can look around South Africa. So I think you can see a pattern here. Next slide. Now we look at the Spanish influenza in detail. Nearly 2% of Africa's population is estimated to have died in 6 months. That's about 2.5 million out of 130 million at that time. But even then, it affected up to 90% of the population, even if it did not directly kill them. Next slide. We even know that roughly 5% of South Africa's population perished in this. And we know that in West Africa, the speed was so bad, it quickly ravaged Freetown, Sierra Leone, and 4% of Freetown's population died in just 3 weeks. In East Africa, it is strongly believed that this pandemic killed 4% of Kenya's population over 9 months. Next slide. Now, Asian influenza, first cases were in China. It spread all over the world. Next slide. We also have the Hong Kong influenza. Next slide. So now we come to our new century. We've looked at cholera, the third plague. We also had yellow fever at some point, but I wouldn't call it a GCBR because it didn't have that extinction value. So we also have HIV/AIDS, a slow-moving pandemic, but thanks to therapeutics, the fatality rate has not been as high. And then we go to the next slide. So in our current time, we have had the 7th cholera pandemic that is still ongoing. We've had the HIV/AIDS, we've had Ebola of West Africa, and we had monkeypox this year. Next slide. So, next slide. This is just a summary of the timeline. Next slide. Again, that's the final part of the summary. Next slide. Yeah, so this looks at the death toll. So you see Black Death 200 million, smallpox 56 million, Spanish flu 40 million, plague of Justinian 30 to 50 million. Next slide. So the goal of this, next slide, the goal of this has just been to give us a overall view. So what are the lessons from the past? Next slide. Okay, so what we have learned is in Africa, indigenous knowledge systems involved things like burning settlements was established as a way to manage diseases before either reoccupying them or shifting homesteads to a new location. And in many times post-pandemic, houses were not rebuilt in those areas. And the layout was so important. This allowed people to stay at a distance from each other, but not too far, to engage in daily care, support, and cooperation. We also know that some communities knew that outbreaks were unpredictable but possible, so they built their settlements in a dispersed version. And we also know that these behaviors were also augmented by diversified diets, which included the things which we are supposed to eat these days, the fruits and the like. We also know that some communities had set apart structures, houses where sick people like leprous people would stay. Next slide. So what can we learn from the pathogens? Next slide. So what we can learn from the pathogens, if you look at the main causative agents over the times, we had Yersinia pestis coming in strong in the initial part, then Vibrio cholerae, but at some point we invented antibiotics. Next slide. And then the viruses had their time on the market. As you can see, most of our century has been viruses. Next slide. So what do we know about the pathogens based on this? Next slide. So we know that viruses are worse than bacteria, and bacteria are worse than things like the plague, right? Then we also know that RNA viruses are more dangerous than DNA viruses. Next slide. And we also know that through God's intervention, really, there is no perfect virus that has a high case fatality rate and a high virulence. It seems that the higher the case fatality rate, the lower the virulence, and it forms a curve coming from the peak of the case fatality up to the peak of the R number. Next slide. And that's the curve being shown here. Next slide. So, Yersinia pestis, interestingly, can be aerosolized as a bioweapon. So it's a category A pathogen, but it can easily be disseminated and transmitted from person to person. Cholera cannot be eradicated since it's waterborne. A colleague asked about IPC. I'll just talk about that after, but here is another concept: WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene. And then finally, the development of a universal vaccine to prevent influenza is underway, but it has been challenging to finish it out because of the constant reassortment. Next slide. So, conclusion, next slide. The globalization of trade and travel of animals, animal-based foods, further increases the spread of infectious diseases and the speed at which they can be disseminated. Land use and urbanization to accommodate agriculture, living areas, modify the habitats of pathogens, hosts and disease vectors, and affect transmission dynamics. Then the geographic distribution of disease vectors and hosts, as well as living habitats or microorganisms, is also very important to note. Next slide. So those are the risk modifiers for future events as you take into consideration. So what are some of the strategies, the basics we really need to get down? WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene. I think you saw from the cholera map and all the other maps that water, sanitation, and hygiene is very key for developing countries. It really helps ensure provision of clean and safe water, effective sanitation, infrastructure, and ensures appropriate hygiene practices. Vector control is a primary tool for control of vector-borne diseases. Implementation of global surveillance programs is key to detect spillovers, and we need to think about building sustainable satellite cities. It's all good to have Lusaka, Cape Town, Kampala, and all these hubs, let me say, Cairo, but let's think of more sustainable cities like our ancestors of time old, whereby people are close enough to interact, but further enough such that you can even implement localized lockdowns for particular cities, whereby everyone has access to groceries and the like within the same city without having to spread diseases so easily. Next slide. So these are the references. The slide will be shared with you. So I want to close by explaining about what the previous colleague asked. What is international health regulations? So international health regulations, these are laws that are developed to prevent the international spread of diseases. International spread of diseases. Secondly, these laws are supposed to ensure there's minimal interference to trade and travel around the world. And these laws were created under the auspices of the World Health Organization. So they are legally binding to the 196 members of the World Health Organization. Now, infection prevention and control is an approach, it is a theory, it is a way, it is an approach to doing things. Like if you're familiar with 5S and what, it looks at key aspects of how infection spreads and things that you can do to mitigate them. So IHR is an international treaty or regulations, and it has things like the monitoring and evaluation frameworks. Countries have to do annual reporting, but they can also have a joint external evaluation with experts from abroad. And countries are expected to develop a national plan for health security, which guides their implementation of the required IHR benchmarks and standards. So things like integrated disease surveillance, infection prevention and control, those are strategies, those are tools that we use to attain particular goals. Integrated disease surveillance improves surveillance, infection prevention and control, limits the spread of infections in health facilities and other places. Water, sanitation and hygiene prevents the spread of waterborne diseases and things of the like. And then finally, GCBRIs, it's like saying climate change. Climate change is a problem. Supervolcanoes is a problem. Nuclear explosion is a problem. Now, when you talk about the COP, the one which they keep talking about, that conference of parties to the climate change agreement, it's like the WHO's World Health Assembly. This is that international body of world governments that meets to deal with the problem. So in a similar way, GCBR is the problem, but IHR is the regulations which WHO made and the World Health Assembly meets to deal with the issue of GCBRs through those IHR. And like the previous speaker said, IHR, its scope in constant review, realized IHR is not equipped to properly handle pandemics. And we are saying pandemics are the little brother of GCBR. So that means if they can't even manage pandemics, they can't manage GCBRs. GCBRs need whole of government, not just health ministries and the like, but whole of government, civilian, military, economics, intellectual property, trade, biodiversity, pathogen sharing, all these things. Thank you very much. I will take questions. You can unshare the slide.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that wonderful presentation. Like we did the last time, we shall take online and offline questions. However, before I go into that, I have a question of my own. I've observed varying timelines over which you measure how many deaths a particular event has caused. Some are as few as 3 years, others as long as 50 years. So is there a specific time range within which we measure an event to qualify to be a GCBR or a pandemic, or it can be any length?
Great. That's a good question. So I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago when President Biden declared that COVID pandemic is over. But actually, we know that the IHR says that it's the WHO director who gets to declare when a pandemic has begun and when it has ended. So therefore, when you're measuring the number of deaths, you only measure the deaths during the period for which that disease was known to be active. So that means if we say that swine Russian flu lasted 3 years, if someone died after the 3rd year, generally we don't count them. But if we say Spanish influenza lasted 10 years, then we count every death within the 10 years. Il y a des questions, tout le monde? Je parle un coup de français. Si tu ne parles anglais.
All right, so I'll take it that everyone understood very well. I'd like then to once again thank Peter for that presentation and then move on to the next presentation, introduce the next facilitator.